And it's 7:03. Ron, it's up to you on whether you want to get going.
Yeah, let's get going.
All
We,
right.
said 7 o'clock, and anyone can jump in, subsequently. But I think it's time to go. First of all, I want to give a hearty thanks to Margaret Stan, who you just heard. Without her, this couldn't happen because technologically, I'm an idiot. I have no idea how this stuff works. I do want to acknowledge the Elting Memorial Library in New Paltz, again, without whom this would not be possible. And I noticed that the director, John Girolico, is in the house, so I will acknowledge him as well. In addition to that, I see Blair Proctor is, right there. I want to acknowledge him also, seeing as how he is on our committee, the Black History Committee at Elting Library, and was in on a lot of the discussions that, made this all possible. So, not at all the acknowledgements I think have been, acknowledged. On with the show. The movie was Lying Lips, 1939. Hopefully everybody got a chance to see the movie. I considered it an interesting movie, not too unlike the movie we saw last month, but with some significant differences, in the movie. I have a few things to say about it, but I'll save my comments and let you talk. So, does anyone have any comments about the movie for this month? Anybody can chime in. Go for it, John.
Now, I have not, but have you seen any of the actors in any other movie that either he made? To me, they all look new from others.
Well, I can answer that, John. And I took a page out of Chester Freeman's book. I think Chester is in the house somewhere.
Okay.
There he is. Yes, yeah. Chester and Linda, they're my swing dance teachers. And something he mentioned last time, which was a very good idea, he kind of looked at the cast of characters and looked them up. Well, I did also for this particular movie. And there's one actor in particular that I've seen in a bunch of other movies. And that's a guy named Juano Hernandez. And I don't think that name means anything to anyone. But he happens to be, in the movie, he played the preacher, and he was in it for a relatively short period of time.
Right.
He's the preacher that explains how, they came up from the South, and this one married that one, and et cetera, et cetera. But he usually plays I would put it this way, the noble black man. Okay, he has the voice, so he's a stage actor, or was. And usually when I've seen him in movies, it's been in later movies where he's the older black man, and he usually plays a character where an older black man is called for. There's one movie I could name where he plays a jazz musician, okay, at a time when most people expected jazz musicians to be black. And sure enough, there he is. So that's the kind of roles he played maybe 10, 12, 15 years after this movie. In this movie, he's relatively young, but I've seen him as an older man, and so on and so forth. Edna Mae Harris is also in the movie. I may have seen her in other movies, but if you look her up on YouTube, she's got a number of movies to her credit, beginning like 10 years before this, working up even, past 1939 when this movie was made. The other actors have more or less disappeared in the 1940s, usually the early 1940s. I looked up their movie credits, and if they had any credits at all beyond this, it generally disappeared around 1942, 43, and that's it. So their careers ended when this genre of Black films ended, apparently. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I was especially wondering about like the lead woman. I mean, she's very talented. She's a singer, dancer, very attractive woman. You'd think she'd be cast in other ways. And I just.
And she was up through the 40s. She was, she had movies before this and after this. So she had somewhat of a career. And I think she made it to studio films
Oh,
the way other, Black actors did in roles that were not terribly prominent, but if you needed a pretty Black woman, there she was.
right. Yeah.
One of several, actually. Anyone else?
Right, Blair has his hand raised.
Go for it.
Yeah, I definitely was looking for James Earl Jones' father, and I could definitely tell that once I saw the detectives. I could definitely tell with the voice that was definitely his father.
Yeah,
and his facial
Darth
expression.
Vader type of that was Robert Earl Jones, James Earl Jones's father. Yes.
But one thing that a couple things that I really enjoyed of the film was seeing Black characters that had an array of professions. And I liked how you had the detectives, you had also the main love interest between the main protagonist and the detective, how he was switching positions and saying that I'm training. So it was like this was almost like his first kind of almost like an internship or into being a detective. And it was in this position that it was personal because it was really searching the culprits that were behind the murder and the plotting of the murder to protect who he loved. So I really liked seeing that. And I also liked how they talked about the historical context of the Great Migration of coming from the South, going up north. So I really liked that aspect. And when I heard the name Laundry, I'm thinking, ooh, they're probably from Louisiana, maybe, Western Mississippi. So, because that's where a lot of my research comes in, focusing on Creole.
I'm glad you brought that up because in 1939, that's something that a lot of Black people in Black communities across the country would relate to. Because they were, the Black migration is still going on, even though it started, back in the last century, just after Reconstruction, still going on. So you have a lot of, Black people up from the South, coming north for jobs and, to get away from Jim Crow and so on and so forth. So that's something that would have resonated very strongly in the Black community. Keep in mind, these movies were meant for the Black community. Anyone else? Did you like the movie? Let me ask that question.
Yes.
Who said that? Yes, I see you. What did you like about it? What drew you to it?
What are you asking?
Whoever. Well, somebody said they liked it, so go for it.
I liked it.
Mm-hmm.
It was fast moving. I was surprised when it was over that it went by very fast. I was engaged in the plot. The love story was sweet, and it was interesting to see this young man taking a role and coming up with theories and saving the day. I also thought it was interesting, like that there was a young boy who plays an important role, which was true in the last movie as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Almost a boy of the same age.
Yeah.
Who has a significant role in turning things. In the first movie, he actually had information. Well, this kid had information also. They had information, but this kid also, did a task that helped the investigation. But the fact that he had a young boy in both of those movies intrigued me.
Yeah. Do you remember how much the boy got for his
A quarter
information?
at first, and then another quarter, wasn't it?
You got it, and that was big money then. It was big money for me 20 years later. Somebody gave me a quarter is 5 candy bars, believe it or not. Back in my day, I don't know what it was in 1939, but yeah, You know, when I was that age, I would have got you 2 Milky Ways, 2 Snickers bars, and you know, name another candy.
I
A
also
payday.
like
You know,
the
perhaps.
settings of the film, the apartments that people were
She
living
does want some.
in. You know, very,
Mhm.
you know, kind of upper middle class apartments, well furnished. Um, you know, the 2 good sized bedrooms. They seemed very economically, financially comfortable.
That's a good comment because it's my guess that most Black people then did not live that way. In other words, their apartments would not have looked like that. And I'm going by the fact that 20 years later, when, you know, in my recollection, most apartments did not look like that. But you could tell that at one time they
Yeah.
did.
Well, and the people who had those apartments were not in high paying jobs. Although
Uh-huh.
the aunt and the niece obviously shared the rent. They were able to get a nicer
Yeah.
place. But I thought it was interesting that he chose to show that as the setting.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
And you'll see that in a lot of similar movies. Go ahead.
I just see that Chester and Linda have their hand raised, and then Alan Stout is on deck.
Okay, Chester and Linda, you're up.
Hi. Well, we'd be very remiss if we didn't mention the dancing in this
Hi.
film.
I was saving that for you.
Yes. So I love the tap dancer, the Cab Calloway look that he had, and you know, his outfit and his hair, and his ability to dance and his little, you know, Nicholas Brothers stuff going on. I mean, he was great. I really enjoyed him. And I don't think I saw we this time and last time we looked to see if the dancers were in the credits, and of course they weren't.
No.
But yeah, so that was fun. And then the chorus girls dancing to Jumping at the Woodside.
Yes.
It was fun.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was fun. Hey, you bring up a good point also. You know, it was dancing in both movies, and that is not unusual. I think I may have mentioned last time or the time before that in the Black community in my day, and this would have been even more pronounced 20 years earlier, that dancing was a very, very prominent thing for young Black people to do. And if you were really good at it, you can make a living at it. But even in my day, you went to dancing school.
Mm-hmm.
I resisted that until like 50 years later. Oops, somebody's phone is ringing. But yeah, the thing to do for men and women, especially, you know, girls in my time, was to go to dancing school. And if you were good, you put on a recital. That is, the dance teacher, you know, did that, and so on and so forth. So it's my guess that, you know, a Black person watching this film back in the 1930s would have been very entertained by watching, you know, somebody dancing and singing, keeping in mind that it had nothing whatsoever to do with the plot of the film. It was kind of a sidelight because they're in a nightclub or whatever, you know, this sort of thing. But it's kind of like putting the film on hold while we watch people dance. And now back to the film, you know, that sort of thing. So again, from a Black person's perspective in the 30s and the 40s also, but this is a 30s movie, watching Black people that look like yourself dance would not have been at all unusual, not at all.
But the difference would be that in this case, the dancing scene was appropriate. They were in a nightclub. They were dancing. You know, they were dressed up. The guy had a tux on. You know, he had some early breakdance moves going on there too, right?
Yeah.
But you know, as you certainly know, Ron, a lot of films at that same time that were, you know, Hollywood films that had Black dancers in them, Hell's a Poppin', you know, where they were, you know, the maids and the cooks, and they're just, you know, dancing for no reason whatsoever.
Exactly.
Just because the director thought it looked really cool, so let's feature it, but it does have nothing to do with the plot, you know, or dancing out in the barnyard, right? Just because they're great dancers.
Yeah.
So this made a little more sense in the plot.
Well, understand that a studio movie that has black people dancing in it are dancing for a completely different reason. Like you say, it has absolutely nothing to do with the plot, and there's a reason behind that, because when these films were shown in the South, where white people did not want to see black people in the film, you could cut the dance sequence out without destroying the integrity of the plot.
Wow.
That's why. In these films, the dancing, even though it doesn't have to do with the plot, it does have to do with the setting. You know, if you follow the plot line, there's a reason why they're in a nightclub. And of course, in a nightclub, people dance. Okay,
Right.
so it leads up to that. In Hell's a Poppin' and other similar studio movies, you know, you'll have a plot, it could be a murder mystery or whatever, and all of a sudden we cut to a barn scene where the cook and the stable person and this person are all of a sudden doing Lindy Hop for no reason at all, but you don't care because you're intrigued by the dancing. And when they're done, now it's back to the plot. So there's a, you know, similarity there, but for a completely different reason.
You said,
Hold on, Linda. We do have people ahead of you in line for questions.
No problem.
Is it relating to what he just said,
right,
or
what you just said, yeah.
okay? One
Just
quick comment.
Just the comment about that if it was shown to a white audience, they might cut that out. Were these films often shown to white audiences?
Put it this way, they were not shown. In other words, these are films that were shown in the black community. If a white person wanted to come to a black movie theater in, say, Harlem, he was welcome to do so. Did they? I guess not. Okay. But there was no reason why a white person could not go, you know, to Harlem or anywhere, any black community, to the local theater. And there were a lot of local movie theaters in black communities, and watch these films. Nobody would have stopped them, although maybe they didn't know that. Okay. By contrast, black people had no problem going downtown in New York, let's say, to the Loews, the Roxy, theaters that no longer exist. But back then, theaters were palaces. And if they wanted to see any of the studio films, they were more than welcome to do so, as long as they sat in the balcony, you know. So I feel that, you know, in those days, black people had the advantage of seeing both the studio films, the Hollywood films, or whatever, and the black films that were only shown in their community, whereas white people only saw the Hollywood movies because they didn't know that these films existed.
And really quickly, correct me if I'm wrong for clarification. When you're talking about films that have these dance scenes featuring black dancers that are able to be cut, these are ones made by big studios, by white directors for, as opposed to these films that are made by black directors for, yeah.
Exactly right. Like I said,
Yep. There's a difference, the difference there.
They're very different. The studio films had these dance sequences in them simply because people are intrigued by dancing, you know, obviously. But there were certain areas of the country where watching a black person on film was not something they wanted to see. So the makers of the film were careful to put these dance sequences in where they would not interfere with the plot. Meaning, if they wanted to extract that sequence out, you could do it, again, without destroying the plot.
Okay, Alan, you have been waiting so patiently. Thank you.
Okay.
And June, you're on
I
deck.
want to mention a scene where her name's Elsa or Elsie.
I think it's
the
Elsie.
lead.
Yeah.
Okay. She's in the bathtub, and I wrote it down as a soliloquy. She's talking and thinking about, I guess, her boyfriend.
Yeah.
And I think what she says is that she's in this relationship, would be the breadwinner, and she would happily hand over her money to him, and he could just give her what she needs.
I'm glad.
I'm pretty sure that's what she says. And there's another quote, I forget where it came, where plenty of women are taking care of men.
Yes.
And that comes into play here.
That's not so exclusive to the Black community. It may be personified in the Black community.
Uh-huh.
And usually it's in a kind of a worse situation where the man, Black or white, is just a lazy bum, and the woman is out working her butt off just to support the both of them.
Okay,
Here,
yes.
you have something similar, only the guy isn't a bum. If you remember at the end of the movie, you know, she says, here's $15,000, you can do what you want. And he kind of balks at first, but then accepts it. If it makes you happy, okay. Well, yeah, that's nice. But yes, that is a concept that was not unknown in the Black community at all. Again, you have to remember, it's the Depression, okay? People are out of work. And it may have been easier for women to get jobs in cabarets here, there, you know, wherever, than men who are, you know, pretty much more suited for manual labor. So yes, that is a concept that has held in the Black community, even up into my time, you know, unfortunately, because like I said, usually the guy is just, you know, a bum, just, you know, living off a woman. And the woman is only too happy to support that. Of course, that's changed today, but back then that was not an uncommon concept. Glad you pointed that out.
Okay,
I was
June,
a
and
little-
then Nicholas is on deck.
Go
I
for
was
it.
a little surprised that as late as 1939, it was very amateurish, the acting particularly. Many of them sounded as if they were just reading their lines. They weren't really acting. And maybe one explanation is that there were probably very few professional Black actors, and that they had to scrounge around to get anybody to be in the movie. But I thought it was, you know, pretty primitive in places.
Yeah, I mentioned last time in the last movie that from a technological and an acting standpoint, you're probably 5 to 10 years behind the studio movies in that regard. What you saw, you know, as far as the prominent actors are concerned, are not cinematic actors, but they're stage actors. So if you notice the dialogue, okay, it's a stage dialogue, not a movie dialogue, okay? And some of the minor actors are probably not actors at all. I think I mentioned this last time, that these may be people almost off the street, you know, for lots of reasons. First of all, they're playing people off the street by and large. And second of all, what are you going to pay them? Not a lot. Again, it's a Depression. You don't have to pay them much. All right. So I think the analogy I made last time is that the difference between studio movies, i.e. Hollywood, and the movies you watch here is that in a studio movie, you're looking up at the actors. And I'm not necessarily talking directional. I'm talking fantasy almost. I mean, when you look at Humphrey Bogart and, you know, Bette Davis and, you know, James Cagney, you don't know people that look like that. Those are actors. They're movie stars. When you see these films in the Black neighborhood, you're looking at people that look just like you. You're looking at ordinary people as they are. You might walk out of that theater and see somebody that looks exactly like one of the characters you saw in the film. You might walk out of the theater and see that character, you know, that guy. You know, it's very possible, you know. So, you know, that's kind of the reason for that. You may not be dealing with professionals in the, you know, by the a definition of the term that you're used to, i.e. a trained movie actor that's been in a lot of movies or whatever. A lot of these people are entertainers. Like I mentioned before, they're dancers, they're singers. So they're used to being in front of an audience. And the top people are stage actors and probably vaudeville veterans. A lot of them were.
I thought it was interesting that you brought that up, considering Ron and I had a little pre-discussion. We were trying to save it for when we got everyone, but I thought it was interesting because this was so much, I thought improved upon maybe isn't the best word, but from the last film we watched, Murder in Harlem, which was 1935, to this film in 1939, I saw an improvement in how they're standing within the set and how they're talking to each other. On the last one, there were a lot of stage actors, and they almost always were facing out to wherever the camera was. And in this one, I noticed more of them actually facing each other and having a dialogue as if you would normally, which is what happens in movies now. Certainly actors are placed so that you can see what the director wants you to see.
Yeah.
But compared to Murder in Harlem 4 years earlier, it felt much more natural.
It's almost like filming a stage play. Although when we had this brief discussion before, I brought out an exception to the rule. If you remember the scene where they're in the quote unquote haunted house and they're trying to scare this guy into talking.
Yeah.
All right. There were times while they're on either side of him and they're holding him and they're threatening him. But there are times when he's telling his story, he's standing straight up. They're on either side of him. You don't really see them, but you see their shoulders and they're almost like at attention. And he's looking straight at the camera, giving his speech or whatever, as if he were on stage. It's as if it were shot separately from the rest of the movie, and it may very well have been.
That's exactly what I thought about that scene, Ron.
Yeah.
It was just like flashing from one scene to another, and I think he recited his whole part,
Yeah.
On a different stage.
It could very well have been.
And I think it was almost, it was representing a flashback, because he was talking about, because it was almost like it was saying that he was focusing on his mind of retelling what was occurring, of what the plot was of those cousins.
Okay.
Yeah, and I didn't think of that. You're probably right, Blair. In fact, I prefer to think that rather than it's a glitch in the movie or a glitch in the direction. Yeah, it is a flashback. And if you notice, that whole scene is there just to let you in on the plot in case you were confused up to that point, which I was.
It was a little confusing.
Yeah. So that guy is saying, in effect, well, in case you didn't get it, here's what led up to all of this. Now that you've got it, let's move on. So, but Blair, that's a good point. I didn't consider that might have been a way that Micheaux chose to do a flashback.
Okay. All right, Nicholas, we're getting to you finally.
Yeah, no, it was fine. First time listener, first time caller. That all these points that you lovely people brought up right before mine kind of just took my point. It was perfectly set up. I'm very glad. And that's in that stage actors, and of course you're in the 1930s. You're just entering an era of talkies, of sound films, and these sound films are, a lot of film actors die off because they can't make the transition from very, very vocalized, not by audibly speaking, but by going and the very, very visual aspect of acting for stage and theater productions. All of the nuances, as it were, of acting as we know it today. What we think makes a great actor. Those are all things that most of these previous 1920s and pre-sound film actors they just lack, specifically because they're used to stage productions even when they're being filmed. Another thing is, if you've ever seen Singing in the Rain, is that audio equipment is now all of a sudden something brand new, and a lot of films and a lot of people just can't transition into that. Where there's this funny scene in Singing in the Rain where they're filming a movie, and the actress in the movie keeps facing towards the microphone and away from the microphone, and they use it as a sight gag, but it really is something that happened. As for the 1930s, and in the context of here, I also was thinking that Harlem, that was very, very, your previous film, what was it again?
Murder in Harlem.
Yeah, Murder in Harlem.
Last month's discussion.
Probably every single year in the 1930s, there was a Black focused film with Harlem in the name. And that was a, primary Hollywood film, which for obvious reasons, but I thought that there was very much like Harlem on the Prairie, or The Two Gun Man from Harlem, or Murder in Harlem, of course. And these are all, I guess my point here is generally that you don't have actors that are well adjusted in the 1930s to sound, much less unprofessional actors in, you know, Black focused films for Black theaters.
Well, there's a reason for that.
Right.
And the reason is from a studio point of view, the fact that you have a studio, the whole concept of a studio is that we'll take you, we'll give you a screen test. If you pass that, we will teach you how to act, how to talk, how to sing, how to dance, your stage presence, the whole 9 yards. If you were Black, that didn't happen. We just put you in front of a camera, and your previous experience, as I mentioned before, would have been vaudeville, you know, stage acting, stage performing, you know, this sort of thing. So that accounts for a lot of the fact that, you know, when you see these actors, they seem unpolished because we're used to the studio films. You are quite right and quite knowledgeable in the fact that in the late 20s and early 30s, there was an awful lot of experimentation done with sound. Some of it's funny. Like I know the scene in Singing in the Rain where they're, you know, yeah, she has a microphone in her breast or whatever.
Right, where they make try to put it in the plant, all these other things. In the
plant, but when she moves away from the plant, you can't hear her. Those things actually, you know, did happen, and there were thousands of people that lost their jobs simply because they had no voice. Either they couldn't speak English at all, or they spoke with horrible accents, or the voice never matched the face or the character that they played. If you look up John Gilbert, he's a perfect example of that. But you're quite right. You know, what you're looking at in these films are unpolished actors to a degree and stage actors, you know, to another degree. You're not looking at film actors, although by 1939, they're getting the hang of it. But I think I mentioned that you know, from a technological standpoint, they're still 5 to 10 years behind the times. Because if you look at a 1939 film, well, let's see, The Wizard of Oz came out in 1939, and so did Gone with the Wind. So if you look at the technology in those films, you know, color is probably the obvious thing. The Black films are well behind simply because couldn't afford it.
Right.
You know, you just couldn't afford that kind of technology, you know, to go along with your artwork. So good comment. Pretty good.
Son of Frankenstein. That's one of my favorite films. I'm a very, very much pre-1930s film buff, but because I love everything of pre-sound film. I just loved it. You know, I studied it for 4 years, and I just kept taking history courses just for that. So I mean, film, pre-1930s film, I love it. And then we get into sound, and yes, all that film is great, and that's what we know is film today, and I love that too. But I just love the way that we did advance so quickly there. You know, in terms of everything relating to movies, all the experimentation before the 1930s. But yeah, Son of Frankenstein there, really good film.
And it is, and I'll give people a reason to, you know, a chance to talk. But I just want to add one thing to what you said. There's a reason why studio films did that, and that is money. And money drives the technology. So by even in the 1920s, during the silent era, millions of dollars were generated, you know, by movies. So there was a great impetus to improve movies once sound movies, you know, became a thing. And by the way, not everybody was in favor of sound movies. I mean, that sounds silly, but there were a lot of people that said movies never talked. Why should they talk now? You know, this sort of thing. But I won't belabor the point. You sound very knowledgeable. I'd like to talk to you sometime. But anyway, who's next?
I have no one on deck with their hand raised, so go for it, Ellen.
Go for it.
Okay, I just wanted to say a little bit more about the character of Elsie. And like the woman in the Murder in Harlem, there was like it was like an issue to preserve her virtue and for her not to have to get mixed up with the women who were driven to a life of sin, and questions of how to do that. That the whole business that starts the plot with the pressure on her future boyfriend to get her to go to the parties after the dancing, and his resigning over that, and that's like a kind of it's a kind of thing that you wouldn't take for granted and being able to do if you were poor and desperate and under the power of your employers. So that becomes an issue.
Sure.
And I wanted to mention the scenes of her in jail as in contrast with the apartment. She's part of the time living in this jail cell and washing the floor. And there was one picture of her. I guess it was taken from up above, and you were looking down at the jail cell and the bars were there. And it was a very, almost like a saint. And it was just a very formal and very lovely picture of her in this jail cell doing this. It didn't exactly go with everything in the film, but there was something very touching about it.
Yeah, I think that scene and those scenes were designed to elicit pathos in the character. You know, I've seen scenes like this in other movies. Almost a stock scene would have been the shadows of the bars looming down. I mean, I've seen that lots of times as well. And I wondered why she was washing the floors in the cells. I didn't think they made you do that in jail, but
the shot is effective.
It is. The shot is very effective. Like I said, it was designed to elicit pathos, where you see the bars and there's this pretty woman down there scrubbing the floors. You really feel sorry for her, you know, at that point. And it was probably designed that way.
And then both of the women in the two films have a kind of an independence along with wanting love and finding love, but definitely not, they definitely have a character of that they're ready to do their lives without that.
Yeah, there's something else.
The right thing comes along.
Yeah, something else that I noticed in this film, and less in this film and more in other films, that the villains are dark skinned. Okay. The heroine and the heroes are lighter skinned. Yeah. The exception to that is Robert Earl Jones, but of course he's like 6'5" with a voice that you know, rivals, you know, Paul Robeson. I mean, he's got that presence, so he could fit almost anywhere in that noble image. But you'll see in some of these films, not so much in this one, but in a lot of these films, that the heroes, the good guys, are lighter skinned and the bad guys are darker. Okay. Also, the good guys seem to have processed hair, if you know what that is, and if anybody doesn't, I'll explain that. And the bad guys have kinky hair. Now, again, that's not a hard and fast rule, but in the Black community in the 20s, 30s, and even in my time, there was a sort of a prejudice against darker people as opposed to lighter skinned people. And the whole idea of processed hair, that is straightening your hair, was an attempt to be, to emulate white people in a way. Now, I won't belabor that point because in the next film, you'll see some of that, which is why I picked it. But you did see a bit of it in this film, although it wasn't as pronounced as some of the other movies that I've seen.
Addie, Addie,
yeah, right.
Addie, do you have a question or a comment related to this current thread of conversation?
Well, I have a comment related to a couple of remarks that have been made.
Okay, yes.
Ellen James was talking about the woman in jail cleaning the floors, and I thought that was very realistic because my mother-in-law spent some time in a nursing home. When she was very ill and old, and I would go and visit her every day, and there was another patient there who was always washing the walls. And I mentioned this to one of the nurses, and she said, that's what she's done all of her life. We let her do that. And I think it was the same thing with the woman who was washing the floors. That's what she did all her life. And so that was a normal behavior. And why stop her from doing something that was part of what she did? It's my first remark. The other remark goes back to what Linda Friedman was saying about the dancing, and you too, Ron, I think that the dancing was normal and expected in a nightclub. It didn't, it was just part of the show, it was part of the background.
Sure.
And I thought it fit very well. It did not seem to intrude to me.
No, it didn't seem to intrude because it was set up in the nightclub scene. In other words, they intentionally put that scene in the nightclub so that you would have dancing in the nightclub. That was the whole point. They could have had that scene anywhere, but they put it in a nightclub where you expect to see dancing so that you would have that entertaining dancing. As far as scrubbing the floors, again, going back to the 20s and the 30s, there were women who did scrub floors for a living. They did it in office buildings and such. I didn't think they did it in jail. I could be wrong, okay? But that was not that unusual for a woman to be scrubbing the floor. So maybe that's why she was scrubbing floors in jail, because again, during the Depression, that's, you know, that was one of the jobs that women were allowed to do, to literally get down on your knees and scrub the floors, although usually there were office buildings and, you know, public buildings and whatnot, but somebody had to clean the floors, and that's how they did it.
Okay, Linda and Chester have their hand raised, and Alan, you're on deck.
Okay, so I hope I remember my 3 things that I wanted to say. But one closest to what you were just talking about, with them cutting out dance scenes, or the ability to cut out dance scenes if they needed to. Well, there's a famous story in the Lindy Hop community of, there was a Judy Garland movie. I don't remember the name of it, Ron, you might. And there was this troupe of Black dancers, and they did their thing, and it was great. It was a fabulous dance scene, or so we're told, but we don't actually have ever had the pleasure of seeing it, because their manager got into an argument with the director, because he said, when Judy Garland took a rest, why can't my dancers take a rest? And they got into an argument, and so they literally cut their scene out of the movie.
Oh,
and I can't remember the name of the movie.
It doesn't sound familiar, but I'll look it up.
Yeah,
I'll figure it.
I have it in the book in the other room, but yeah.
Okay.
But it's same time period, and it just goes, that would have been a Hollywood movie in which a dance scene would have been inserted for no reason, so therefore easy to take out.
Easy to take out, yeah.
Exactly. The other comment I wanted to make about the actors, the Hollywood actors were on contract. You were contracted to a studio, and then you were owned by the studio, you were coached by the studio, you were named by the studio. And these actors are not, that they're getting a job as a job comes available, right?
There is no black studio.
Right, exactly. There's no big Hollywood studio that's going to sign them and give them PR and give them everything.
Exactly.
And then the last comment that I wanted to make was that in the beginning, I noticed that in the credits in the beginning, it said that the film had an all-colored cast. That's what the words were on the thing in the beginning.
Yes. And
so of course they did, except for the 2 white guys that own the club, right?
They were Italian in the movie, because that's meant.
Which is a very good point, because in those days, Italians were called the dark-skinned people. So they were as close to black as they could get while they were white, right?
Yeah.
And also that I wondered if they cut the, because it's very jarring that they completely cut out any court scenes whatsoever. So, she's being, she's arrested, and then the next thing we know, she's a convict and she's in jail, and we're like, well, what happened? There was no trial, there was nothing, there was no court scene, and might have been because they would have had to have white actors playing judges and everybody in a court, lawyers and whatnot. So,
well, not necessarily, because if you remember the last movie, there is a court scene, there's a trial. And I believe everybody there, I forget whether the judge is black or not, but I believe he is. I'm not quite sure.
Really?
But they have a trial. They did have a court scene, but not, you're right. In this movie, you go right from being accused to jail.
Yeah, it was very jarring. It was like, wait, did I miss something? Did they?
Yeah. Where's the
you lose
scene?
half the
They
tape?
cut that out. Yeah.
There were white police and prosecutors.
Yes.
And-
Right. In fact, Robert Earl Jones, I think, originally appears with a white policeman in uniform.
Right.
And it was interesting how those how the white characters wanted to use certain black characters to communicate with other black characters. There's like a pipeline of pushing people around through other people.
Yeah, I forgot that. That is actually mentioned.
Yeah.
I think the white, police officer or the person the district attorney who's white, says that, you guys are better off investigating this because you can get closer to the people, involved. And of course it's implied that because you're black and they're black, et cetera, et cetera. So,
and the employers too say the same thing about he's the one who has to tell the girls to go to parties.
Exactly. That is true.
Right.
So, anyone else on deck?
We have Alan on deck.
Go for it, Alan.
I have a comment, but I just want to jump back to scrubbing the floors.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a little bit of, I think there's a trope in the military, a punishment, one of the worst punishments is scrub the latrine floor with a toothbrush. And I've seen that a number of times.
Alan,
it's like, this is the tough stuff,
Alan,
this is a bad.
I can verify.
My main comment was, I wonder if some of you saw the article in the New York Times last week about dialect coaching. It reminded me of this film and this class we're taking, that it's really a developing field, and now more minority coaches are becoming involved. It said that, prior to a few years ago, white coaches would be coaching, Negro accents.
Exactly.
And so a lot of stereotypes developed, and then future filmmakers coached their black actors to talk like, they did in the films that they saw previously. And it didn't necessarily relate to real accents, but it was interesting now that there's a lot more interest in the characters being coached by natives of the parts that they're playing.
Yeah, you raise a good point. The the people, the black actors that played stereotypical black people, Lincoln Perry, better known as Stephen Fetchit, is probably the best example. If you remember how they talked, they were coached by white people because black people just didn't speak that.
Right. That's kind of crazy.
There were a lot of white people that expected or thought that black people spoke that way. So they had to be coached to do that. It's odd that, or interesting that the old Amos and Andy radio series, Raymond Godson and Charles Correll played Amos and Andy. And if you listen to the radio show, that is stereotypical black. They're both white.
Yes.
They're not black at all. They didn't turn black until the TV show Amos and Andy when they had to be. But back then in radio, they were white. So this goes back to the turn of the last century where, black actors or whatever had to be coached to speak quote unquote black on stage by, white, speech coaches.
Wow.
I see that Nicholas has his hand raised. Chester and Linda, you're on deck, and Addie, you're after Chester and Linda.
Go for it, Nicholas.
Yeah, I was just saying there was that that opening line from that manager was right about he says hi, he greets our main character, and then he says heavens or tips, one of those two. What have you been doing? Hijacking somebody. And I thought it was such an odd line to put if you're making the film, but I guess it's because this is our Italian actor speaking in a very much, sorry, where are you going? You know, the whole, you know, Maltese, Burmese Falcon type speech. I was just wondering what would be the purpose behind kind of putting that sort of line, or maybe I'm just missing the context of what hijacking somebody would mean in 1939.
Well, it's about 10 years after the year. Keep in mind, during Prohibition, hijacking was a very common thing where you'd hijack a load of booze, you know, illegally being transported from point A to point B. So hijacking, you know, in the gangster world was a very, very common thing to do. And I'm guessing now, but that became a euphemism for almost any, you know, illegal endeavor. So who are you hijacking now?
Right.
Meaning, you know, who are you, you know, taking off? Who are you, you know, whatever. So that's a guess. But again, the term comes from maybe 10 years earlier when, you know, hijacking a load of booze was not uncommon at all.
Just a fun, I guess it's an odd thing. I guess it's an odd thing for an all black movie production to include, but I guess it makes it more real, right?
I was going to say yes and no, because again, you've got to, you know, put that note of reality in there. Who would have owned a nightclub in 1939?
Right.
But, you know, white people, probably Italians, this is stereotypical, and they're probably on the shady side, hence the hijack. Again, I'm reading into that.
Right.
That would have made sense back then, because the perception would have been, if you're Italian, you must be a gangster. If you own a nightclub, you know, keep in mind, nightclubs 10 years earlier had bathtub gin. I mean, you went to a nightclub to drink. Drinking was illegal, so you had to drink something. And, you know, if you hijacked the booze from somewhere, well, there's your alcohol and so on and so forth. So I'm guessing that's the reason for that.
Okay. Chester and Linda.
Yeah, so Chester brought the book out. And so the movie was Judy Garland's Everybody Sing. And I don't know the year of the movie, but it's saying here that the you know, the Big Apple was the big dance in 1937. So I guess it was around there. They were putting a Big Apple scene into that movie. And the way they were doing it was that they're on a tour bus through Harlem on their way to the Savoy Ballroom. They see the kids dancing in the club, get off the bus and end up watching them dance. So they're literally watching them dance at the Savoy.
That's great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Recreated Savoy in Hollywood.
If
that's what they did, yeah.
If I may, that's a 1938 film. There, it's a classic too. Yeah, Judy Belair. You know, I love how, and that was very much a common thing where first actress name would become the first name of your character there. But Judy Belair goes to a course to replace a classical course piece with her school choir with a very modern, at the time, hip beat, and that's the excuse their teacher needs to expel her from her all-girls school. It's a good film. I would recommend it.
No, good.
And when you watch it, see if you could figure out where they cut the scene with that had the Lindy Hoppers in it.
Yeah.
All right. So we had Addie up next, and then we have Blair on deck.
Mine is very brief, and then I have to leave actually because I had a phone call which I've got to return. But many years ago, I was doing a talk on Sojourner Truth, our very famous Sojourner Truth. And after I was finished, this was for a speech communication group. And after I was finished, someone said, well, why didn't you have her speak with a black accent? And I said, because she was not raised in the South. She came from Ulster County, New York, and she had lived with a Dutch and a French family in that time. We have no evidence that she would have used a Southern U.S. accent, which we often associate with Black people who live in the South. And this was a wonderful film and a great time, and thank you so much. Sorry I have to leave. Thank you.
All right,
Thanks for
Addie.
coming.
Time.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, Addie.
Bye, Addie.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Okay. Blair, you're up.
Yeah, and also what I noticed is that with the performances at the nightclub, that even because I remember what was discussed earlier is that the owners were the Italian cousins, right?
Yeah.
But it was interesting of seeing that the patrons were Black, that were actually that were sitting, because usually when I think about those the chorus girls, that usually there was a term called black and tans back in the day, where you would have Black performers for white patrons, and so I thought that was awesome to see that it was Black patrons that were supporting the Black artists.
Well, I brought this out in the thing that Margaret and I did, about swing dancing and the Savoy Ballroom, that the big nightclubs, would hire Black, performers, but Black people were not allowed in the front door, certainly not as a patron to sit down and actually, do anything. So what Black people had to do is have their own nightclubs, and there were very many of them. There were an awful lot of Black nightclubs in Harlem, in other Black communities, and so on and so forth. And that's what you saw in the film. It's a Black, maybe owned by Italians, maybe owned by white people, because they had the front money to be able to open the place and run it, but they ran it for Black people. And the basic reason for that was that's where the money was. Black people are willing to spend money. And the one thing you're going to spend money on during the Depression is entertainment, movies, booze, and dancing, So yeah, that's the reason for that. That's why you had a nightclub with Black patrons, Black dancers, and so on and so forth. The opposite of that would have been the Cotton Club, where all of the patrons were white.
Okay.
And all of the entertainers were Black.
Okay, yeah. There was a Cotton Club in Chicago as well that was also right off of my old neighborhood of Bronzeville. So, and it was right just on the border of the Kennedy Expressway. It was on the opposite side. So I'm kind of curious. I'll probably want to do some future research on my own to see, how that was run back in the day as well.
Yeah, I'd be curious about that, because the Cotton Club in Harlem was owned by Oni Madden, who was a gangster.
Okay.
I could say more about that, but I'd be off the topic. So, anyone else? Are we?
Just a side note. Your Black and Tans might even be an Irish term right after your 1920s, your Roaring 20s of bootleg liquor and whatnot. Because the Black and Tans, as I remember, were, and I'm sure the term was definitely used, were just British police that would help Ireland out with the rebellion back in. And I could assume that then immigrants within the Irish criminal element might even use those to describe their clientele of these nightclubs, But I would wonder whether would that be actually free mingling of Black and other races, or would it be like kind of restrict or like almost in a I can't, like a diorama way where it's nice for viewing, but it's not really happening. It's everybody's kind of forced into their respective places.
Well, interesting you bring that up. Black and Tan does refer to the uniforms of the British police officers in Ireland. This goes back even before World War I. So the question you'd be asked if they thought you were undercover was, are you the tan? Meaning, are you a cop? So that's where the term Black and Tan comes from. It's also a drink where you're mixing, light beer and dark beer, and you end up with tan beer, and, however appetizing, that might be. But it's interesting that you bring this up, and I won't spend a lot of time on it because it's a subject unto itself, but there was a mixing of Black and Irish. If you go back to the 1840s and 1850s, both the Blacks and the Irish lived in Five Points, a notorious hellhole in New York. And the rumor, and I think it's probably true, that it was a black man and an Irishman together who invented tap dancing, which is very close to Irish step dancing and clogging and that sort of thing. So there was kind of an almost symbiotic relationship between the Irish and the black, who were both considered to be somewhat less than human. Also, there were very serious clashes between the Irish and black people. If you want to read about some of the worst of it, look up the draft riots in 1863 in New York. But again, I'm off the topic, so someone else. I'm likely to run off on all of these topics, and I shouldn't.
There's some great topics.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have a whole second series. That's all the topics we didn't cover in this one because they're off topic. We'll just make a whole series out of that.
We make a list of them because this does trail off into a bunch of other things. Anyway, it looks like that's it, unless anybody has any other comments. So I thank you for joining me. Very interesting comments. Some of the things you brought up were things that I just didn't think of. And keep in mind, I may sound like an expert here, but I'm just one step ahead of you. You know, the movies that you're watching, I've seen, but maybe a month before, you know, when I decided to, you know, put it on the list of movies to be seen. So, you know, I'm learning just about as much from you as you may be learning from me in my comments. And I think we're both learning from the movies that we watch. So the next movie, I forget the date. I think it's December 2nd.
December 2nd. Yep.
And the name of the movie is God's Stepchildren. And a very different movie. And as I mentioned at the outset, this movie brings up a particular topic that I think should evoke some, you know, discussion. So in any case, thank you very much for joining us. And unless anybody has any other comments.
I have some reminders.
Go for it.
All right. So I want to thank Ron for coming out and hosting this. You can either use your, there we go, or you could use your hand clapping reaction. God's Stepchildren is happening December 2nd. By the time this video has gone up to our YouTube channel, there will be a registration. However, if you have already registered for this series, you don't need to re-register. I will send you an email on the day of next month. You don't have to worry about registering again. I have you on an emailing list. I've got you now. Of course, you can always email to be taken off the list if you find you don't want to continue with the series, but you will get an email from me with the next the link for the next discussion. I did drop the links. I know some people joined us late. I dropped links in the chat box to some upcoming events we have at the library. Both do require pre-registration. One is hosted by the library itself, and one is brought to us by, I believe, the Ulster County Library Association. We have Susan Stesson-Cohen is joining up with Albert Cook again to bring us another presentation based off her book, In Defiance, which came out in 2016. And that will be on
November 16th.
November 16th, Monday, November 16th. And what the other program is a Medicare program talking all about eligibility, how and when to enroll, how you can make changes and insurance options. And that's happening on November 14th. Both of these require pre-registration, so I dropped the links to do so in the chat box. You can also find the links to those on our web calendar. And as always, check the web calendar for any upcoming events we have.
Okay,
Just a question, what chat box is that? I'm not
Okay, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you're gonna, and you kind of move your mouse around, you're gonna see a bar pop up with options at the bottom of your screen.
Right, I'm on the mobile here.
Chat.
Right, so I see chat, but the last one I see, maybe it was before I joined, perhaps. That's probably
possibly,
what it
yep.
was.
So if I say
copy,
hi, it should pop up again.
I see it, yeah, so I definitely see hello. I see hi.
Yep. So you can, as always, go to our web calendar and you can find those registration links. But you don't need to re-register for this series. That's one of the reminders I wanted to give. Hey, John, am I missing anything?
I think you've got it. I didn't look at the calendar.
Hopefully I have it down by now.
I should have looked at the calendar before this, but I was caught up with something else. Yeah.
Okay. I think those are the main events. Of course, we always have children's programming happening as well. If you have any children or grandchildren that you know, we do have a lot of virtual programming for them as well. Just throwing that out there. All right. Thank you to everyone for coming. It's always a great discussion. Oh, yes, Blair.
I just want to say real quick, a shout out to some of my students that came to support this event for Ron.
Yes,
Okay.
I was.
Elton Library. So I just wanted to say
I was very
thank you.
happy to see their registrations. I was seeing all the hawk mail. So
Yes.
thank you for bringing them.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Yes.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ron.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dilting.
Thank you.